Mr. Zach Goldsmith.
Speaker. So if you'll allow me, Mr. Speaker, I think it is worth taking stock of where we are. So the government's recall bill still has no friends really at all in its current form. It still proposes a system of recall that is possible only in the very narrowest of circumstances, and in most cases still only by permission of MPs. It will do nothing to empower voters, and for that reason it has been savagely criticised by every single pressure group campaigning for improved democracy. Everyone from 38 Degrees and Unlock Democracy on one side all the way to the Taxpayers Alliance. It's been trashed by everyone from the Morning Star to the Telegraph, which described it as an insult to voters only a few weeks ago. And as a consequence, the Prime Minister himself felt obliged to describe it as the minimum acceptable, I think are the words he used. Labour's Shadow Minister said, and I quote, "The bill needs to be strengthened considerably from its current state in order for it to have meaning. It is simply not good enough." The public... please.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Doesn't he agree with me that the fundamental flaw in this recall bill is that it doesn't actually contain a recall mechanism?
Exactly right. This is not recall as it is understood really anywhere in the world. But just to continue the quote of the Labour's Shadow Minister, the bill needs to be strengthened considerably in its current state in order for it to have meaning. It simply is not good enough. The public will rightly expect more. Even the Deputy Prime Minister who wrote the bill has had to express difficulties with it. But after all that huffing and puffing, here we are today with more or less exactly the same bill, a bill that no one likes. And yes, there are a few amendments being proposed, but they are, if we're honest about it, red herrings. They add nothing useful to the bill. So Labour's main proposal, for example, number 14, I hope that's correct, all that does is it lowers the threshold so that honourable members who are suspended from this House for 10 days or more automatically qualify for recall. The original proposal is 21 days, but the only effect that will have is in the judgments made by a committee of parliamentarians. They'll simply rejig the way they sentence MPs accordingly. And actually, the 10-day rule would have spelt the end for any number of honourable members who have simply been sanctioned for engaging in protest. Now, the honourable member, please.
I was grateful to Richard Park for giving way. If I could perhaps for his benefit clarify, it specifically excludes those members who have been named by the Speaker for parliamentary protest in the Chamber. It does require the Standards Committee, accepting his observations on that, it does not capture those members who have engaged in parliamentary protest.
Yeah. Grateful to him for clarifying. In that case, it changes nothing at all. But I'm pleased with the point. Yeah, I'm reassured. I'm reassured by the point he's just made. But all this does, in real terms, is it creates a different dynamic, a different impetus for the Committee of Parliamentarians. They will simply pass different judgments accordingly. The main Lib Dem amendment, new clause 2. Introduces a new trigger altogether, misconduct in public office. And it sounds great, and I think some people might be reassured by it, but it doesn't really add anything very material at all to the bill. And I have looked into this, and I have sought advice. And I quote some of the advice that has been issued. The Crown Prosecution Services says that this should apply, quote, only where the facts are so serious that the court's sentencing powers would otherwise be inadequate. The House of Commons Library says there are few prosecutions, suggesting that action is taken only when misconduct is particularly gross. The courts have said the threshold is a high one, requiring conduct so far below acceptable standards as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in the office holder. A mistake, even a serious one, will not suffice. If we're honest about it, the only reason this amendment has been brought forward is so that the mainstream parties can pretend they've addressed one of the main concerns of the bill, which is that it leaves MPs in charge. So we have, please.
Honourable Gentleman for giving way. He was saying that, for example, I think there that a mistake, even an honest one, will not suffice. Does he actually think that MPs should be subject to recall just because they've made an honest mistake?
Arguments about recall, look, I'm deliberately trying not to rehearse the arguments that were put forward at the last stage because I lost those arguments by a ratio of 2 to 1. But I do fundamentally disagree with his view on how recall should be used. I know that I was elected largely on the basis that I would put up a fight against Heathrow expansion, but I also believe that had I immediately after the election taken a non-executive role within British BAA, and even an unpaid role of some sort, and flipped my position entirely, that would have amounted to a fraud on my voters. I believe they should have had the right at that point to recall me had I performed such a U-turn. He disagrees, and I think there's a fundamental philosophical difference there. But I won't rehearse that, because as I said, I accept that I lost those arguments a few weeks ago, sadly. So we have the same bill, more or less, with a few synthetic changes if they're passed later on today, and we're supposed to believe that the three main parties are all of a sudden happy with it. Well, maybe they are, but if they are, it's only because they weren't really, properly, genuinely, authentically unhappy with the old version that we were debating. Either way, I think it's an embarrassing, insulting nonsense. They have tied themselves up in knots to avoid letting voters hold them to account, all the time pretending that they're doing the opposite. And as if to prove how seedy this affair has become, I've seen the most extraordinary letters sent by MPs to their constituents explaining why they blocked real recall. I'm not going to rattle them all off, but I'll give you one example, which I just find extraordinary. Well, maybe I will, I'm tempted to. The member for Torbay, who told his constituents that he opposed real recall because, and I'm going to quote him, I could have faced recall for voting in favour of an in-out referendum. He added, I could have faced a recall campaign for having voted to close corporation tax loopholes. Does he really, honestly, truly believe that his constituents would have wanted to recall him for doing either of those things? Is it possible to have a greater contempt for one's voters than he expresses in this article in his local newspaper? I've seen countless letters explaining that pure recall would undermine the independence of MPs. Letters, incidentally, sent by MPs so dependent that they have never once strayed from the party whip. They've never once been disobedient to the parties that they serve. And then we have the Deputy Prime Minister. He robustly opposed real recall 6 times in this chamber that I'm aware of. 6 times he was on the record opposing a California-style recall. Then, yeah.
Could he just clarify for me whether he has notified the honourable member for Torbay that he's mentioned his name in this debate?
I didn't. I'm not aware that I was supposed to. And if I perhaps I'll be recalled under the new mechanism he's putting forward.
The point's been made. Normally it is good practice just to let people know if you're going to name them. I'm sure it wasn't done intentionally. Is that correct?
I do apologise. It's not a convention that I was aware of, and certainly wasn't intentional. But the Deputy Prime Minister, who has 6 times in this House formally on the record opposed real recall, and then as the pressure earlier this year began to rise for proper recall, he felt the pressure clearly, and he told his listeners on LBC, and I've got the exact quote here, Zach and I are completely at one. I actually have no objection at all to the kind of radical California-style recall that he likes. The real problem, he added, is that it has absolutely no hope of being passed into law because of profound objections from Conservative colleagues. But then, of course, when it came to a vote, a free vote for the coalition, if not the Labour Party, his party trooped as one through the no lobby against real recall. In the last debate on recall, members were asked to trust voters to hold them to account, and a majority declined, sadly. And I genuinely believe that the establishment's refusal to share power means ultimately it will lose that power. But the result was clear, and for that reason I've not brought forward any new amendments of my own. It was clear that the House, as it is today, is not ready for proper recall, and I would be wasting people's time, wasting the House's time, were I to rehearse all those arguments and to attempt to retable those amendments. But there is some good news. In an impassioned speech from a member for the Scottish National Party, and the title, the name of his constituency is so complicated that I think it's a disincentive to quote him. So I'm not going to. Is that right? Okay. Well, that's what we call it in English. I wasn't aware of that. I was going to try and attempt the native version, but I'm afraid I would have got it wrong. But nevertheless, in an impassioned speech, he said that reform, even if it's rejected by this House, reform is inevitable. And he is right. PPCs, candidates up and down the country from all parties, Labour, Lib Dem, Conservative, and the rest, are positioning themselves against their incumbents on the basis of where they stand on recall. Please.
Say that recent news that has highlighted the public's distaste for a political elite holding themselves to themselves and ruling over the people is another aspect of why the public will be very frustrated that this bill does not include the real recall provisions which he proposed at second reading.
I couldn't agree more strongly, absolutely, and I welcome his intervention. But I do think change is inevitable. I do think we're moving in the right direction, and I do believe with a new composition after the next election, we'll be in a better position to bring in a genuine form of recall. I think that will happen. I certainly hope that will happen. But in the meantime, let us not insult voters with this this placebo that is being offered today. People who are interested in politics already know that this bill is a sham, it's a stitch-up, and the rest, those people who aren't paying attention today perhaps, will discover for themselves at the very first scandal. So let us walk away from this disgraceful piece of legislation and wait perhaps until this House grows the collective proverbials in order to do the right thing. I have finished, but if he wants to intervene,
Let me speak. If you could just perhaps clarify, notwithstanding his acceptance of the result from the last time, but could he just clarify on the number 24, which deals with MPs who fiddle their expenses, is it his intention to oppose that this evening if there is a division?
I had finished my speech, and I'm very happy to answer that question, if that's all right. It's my intention not to vote one way or the other on these amendments or the bill, because I don't want to give it any, I don't want to sound too important, too self-important, but I personally don't want to give it any credibility at all. This bill is a sham, it's a shambles, it's a farce, it's an insult and a disgrace, and I don't want to have anything to do with it. When we come back to this House with the proper proposal, I will engage again, but for now, I would advise all those members who believe in democracy, believe in reform, and believe in genuine recall to walk away, wait for another time.